Do you know the history of imitation training? And today we're going to dive in a little bit on the history of imitation training, at least from a behavioral perspective. So, for those of you that don't know, the initial studies on imitation training were published in the 1960s. Bear and Sherman published a study in 1964 and a follow up study in 1967. There are a few other studies looking at the similar aspect of imitation training as Bear and Sherman that were published around the 60s, 70s. And then there was like a couple in the 90s, I think one in the 90s and one in the 2000s. In that research, imitation was conceptualized as observational learning, and the children in the studies, it was single subject design, typical for behavior analytic research, no criticism specifically to that, just pointing out that it was single subject. And the few participants that were in the studies had their food restricted, so they weren't allowed to eat anything except for during their imitation training sessions. If the child did not imitate the modeled response, then they were prompted and they received edible reinforcement for engaging in imitative responses. How many hours per day did this training happen? 8, at least in the initial study. What does that mean for the work we do now in 2024 compared to the 1960s? Well, we should probably really be examining the procedures we're using to teach imitation. At least in behavior analysis, our own textbook, the main one used by everyone, Cooper, Heron, and Heward, provides these specific citations, Bear and Sherman, the 1960 articles, when they say there's plenty of research to identify that imitation can be taught. These are the studies that they're referencing. They're not referencing things from the 1990s, 2000s, or after. So that do this imitation procedure that pretty much everyone uses in behavior analysis and now in school settings a lot as well is derived from that early research in the 60s. And there's a lot of questions we need to be asking ourselves. First of all, are we actually teaching imitation for 8 hours a day? Second of all, are we restricting food? Hopefully not. Hopefully you're not even using edible reinforcement for something like imitation that's social communicative in nature. And the biggest question we need to be asking is, how does the research from the 60s match what we've learned about imitation over the past, 60 years? We've learned a ton about imitation, both for typical development and for autism specifically, as well as just different disabilities overall. And as I've already mentioned in some of the other videos, what we know about imitation now in 2024 does not match the understanding of imitation in the 60s. In the 60s, the goal was we teach imitation for observational learning, then it will be easier to teach other things. But in 2024, we understand through the research on reciprocal imitation training, there's a ton of different social communicative ways of teaching imitation, especially coming out of the research lines on naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions that show the social communicative nature of imitation develops first. Even in a few days after birth, do we start to see for some infants this type of imitation happening. This imitation training that is so popular was really developed in the 1960s, and it does not match the current research understanding either in either direction in terms of how imitation develops and what's the scope and sequence of that skill, looking at social communication function into observational learning and generalized imitation. And it doesn't match what we know about the best interventions for teaching imitation at this point and really promoting that social communicative function and generalized imitation.